James and John. What's not to love about those two disciples? I got fascinated with them this week, so I had to look up all the different references to James and John. And I've drawn the conclusion that the Gospel of Mark kind of likes James and John more than the other Gospels. The Gospel of Mark, which is considered the Gospel that was written first, put down first, this Gospel seems to have particular nuance and detail about these two brothers that aren't in other Gospels. James and John, Mark chapter 1, were called by Jesus. They were the second set of fishermen. Jesus first called Peter and brother Andrew, Simon Peter. And then Jesus went a little further down the shoreline and called James and John, who were mending nets. And they were the sons of Zebedee, the sons of Zebedee. So an interesting part of their call story, when Jesus says, come follow me, and they followed Jesus, they left Zebedee behind. Remember that day when Larry Scott looked very forlorn in the boat? That was James and John's story. So they went out with Jesus. In chapter 3, we heard about James and John again, and maybe this is what alerted me to pay closer attention to James and John. I think a lot of times I just have read stories and, it's disciple this or that, but it's very unique to have named disciples in stories. So chapter 3, only in Mark's gospel, there is a list of the 12 disciples. So there's that boring-looking list of names, and they were named and then they were sent out as apostles. But only in the Gospel of Mark are James and John given extra detail. It says, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. Detail. Then it goes on. And he gave them the name. What? I'm guessing that he is Jesus. Jesus gives John and James an extra name. And the word supplied is Boanerges, which is kind of a mystery. And the only time I've really had to pronounce that word out loud, it's there. And then the gospel supplies a translation, but no one totally knows what this Boanerges means. But the Gospel of Mark supplies, do you remember their nickname? Well, Sons of Thunder. Isn't that delicious? They are so Marvel Universe ready. James and John, Sons of Thunder. That's these guys. So I thought it's important for us to remember who these guys are. Because they seem a little sassy today, don't they? James and John are part of Jesus' inner circle. So you read through the Gospels. I know Peter gets the headline. Simon Peter, he's in lots and lots of stories in the Gospels. He gets headline. But James and John, definitely best supporting actors. They are next in line in mentions, and more so than Andrew, Peter's brother. You see James and John. They show up on the sidelines. Jesus gives them extra teaching, extra explanations. In chapter 9, we skipped chapter 9, we'll get back there again after Easter. There's this epic story called the Transfiguration, where Jesus is glowing and prophets from the past appear. He's up a mountain. Jesus only scoops up 3 disciples in that powerful scene. That's kind of this epiphany of who Jesus really is. And James and John are there. Watch for them. Later on, we're going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane. Guess who's there when Jesus pulls away and takes an inner group with him? James and John. So Doesn't it sound a little sassy, James and John, going up to Jesus and saying, we have a favor to ask. And then they said, grant us that when you are in glory, that we might be seated on your right and on your left. That sounds like kind of a power grab, doesn't it? Kind of egocentric. And we, if you've been paying attention, know where Jesus stands when it's about ego and power grabs. We saw it last week in chapter 8. Even when Peter made a point to kind of maybe protect Jesus, Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." Very powerful words. You're thinking about human ways and not divine ways. So Jesus has already laid down a marker that there's a human way and there's a divine way. So know the difference. And last week, Jesus kind of explained, what's the human lane, what's the divine lane. And the divine lane, modeled by Jesus, is the way of humility, the way of the cross, and it's a very different way, the way of suffering. Yikes. So we know where Jesus stands on power grabs and ego. He's against it. And last week we had some fun looking at Jesus' emotions and what gets under Jesus' skin, where he gets upset or indignant. But note that today, if you go back and you read this story, Jesus is not upset with James and John's favor. You would think he'd be like, "How dare you? That's very power grabbish of you." Instead, Jesus says to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink my cup? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized?" So, what does that mean? Drink the cup. So, we have to be non-literal here. Jesus is using the cup image as his calling, as his lot in life. Are you able to drink Jesus' cup, the cup of suffering in this case? Are you able to do that? And then Jesus underlines it a little bit more, talking about baptism. And it's not literal. It's not Jesus being baptized by John back in chapter 1. Here, baptism points to the cross, a living out of his calling, his suffering, his death. That's the truth, guys. So Jesus doesn't get upset with James and John. He is sober with them. He is trying to disabuse them of having any naivete about the seating and glory in the end. Now, surprising, Jesus doesn't get mad at them. And then another surprise, when James and John respond to Jesus, they have a very strange, unusual, I'd say unexpected reaction. When Jesus before has challenged the disciples and used non-literal language, when he's pointed to something bigger, more difficult, non-concrete, the classic way that the disciples respond is, "Huh? What? I don't get what he's talking about." Take a look at Mark 7. They did not understand when Jesus was talking about the loaves. Take a look at Mark 4, the parable of the sower. They couldn't follow what Jesus was doing. So that's typically when Jesus uses imagery, a lot of times the disciples don't get it. That's not the case here. Another response when Jesus challenges people happens in this very chapter, chapter 10. There's a man that comes up to Jesus and wants to follow Jesus. And he knows all the law and the prophets. He knows what the priorities are. And then he's like, what else do I need to do, Jesus? Sign me up. I'm ready to go. And Jesus looked at him with love and says, you lack only one thing. Go sell all your possessions and then come follow me. That man's response? Shock and grief. Too hard. So here, where Jesus sobers up James and John with the big picture of how difficult it's going to be, James and John don't respond, what? Huh? What's he talking about? Could he give us a more concrete picture? They don't go there. And they don't walk away like, man, that sounds too hard. We get what he's talking about? Not so much. Instead, James and John respond, we got this. Interesting. So Jesus could have then said, guys, you really don't know what you're talking about. He might have seen that as kind of ego, bravado. How dare they say, we got this? Do they really get it? Jesus doesn't scold them at all. So, what an interesting story. That goes into an extra inning. Because the other 10 disciples happen to be there, and they hear something about seating. What seating? Is there some kind of seating in Jesus' glory? What's going on here? Here's the emotion. The other 10 disciples show up angry. They are so angry at James and John. Can we imagine why? And they're not mad at Jesus. They're mad at James and John. Well, this kind of harkens back to Mark chapter 9. In Mark chapter 9, Jesus overhears grumbling as he's traveling with the disciples, and he knows they're arguing. And he says, what are you guys arguing about? And the disciples look a little guilty. They don't want to tell Jesus what they've been arguing about because they were arguing about who was the greatest. Jesus knows what they're arguing about. They're human. And Jesus there in chapter 9 teaches, if you want to be great, you need to be a servant. You need to be a servant. Those who are last shall be first. Those who are first shall be last. One of many, many teachings of Jesus. This is Jesus's norm. Jesus's convention. I need to say this a lot because I feel like a lot of people in our culture who talk about Jesus, I don't know who they're talking about. At the center of who Jesus is a servant. And these chapters, Mark 8, 9, and 10, make that abundantly clear. In fact, it was so hard for me to pick out stories in this part of Mark because the themes were so repetitive about being a servant. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. These are repeated all throughout these chapters. Also within these chapters, in each of 8, 9, and 10, Jesus shares a foretelling what's going to happen in the future. We talked about this last week, about himself. That the Son of Man is going to be betrayed. The Son of Man, that's how Jesus talks about himself, is going to be handed over to the authorities who are going to have a false trial. And there's going to be suffering and abuse, and I'm going to be killed. So Jesus explains that 3 times to the disciples. So all that's going on, the way of suffering, the way of service, the last shall be first, the first shall be last. So that's the context of James and John's ask. I think they get it about ego and power, because right before the ask, Jesus has had his third foretelling that, we're headed to Jerusalem right now, and it ain't going to be pretty. And right after that, James and John ask Jesus and say, We got this. We can drink your cup. We can be baptized the way you are. So I think that Jesus believes them. Meanwhile, those 10 disciples who overhear it are not interpreting James and John in the same light. I would say even the Gospel of Matthew, where this story is also told in chapter 20, Matthew, which is seen as written about 15 years or so after Mark, has a different interpretation. In Matthew's Gospel, it's not James and John who ask Jesus about the seating. It's their mother. And their mother seems a little pushy about it. And the James and John, they aren't even named. They're called the sons of Zebedee. So it's almost as if the Gospel of Matthew is distancing these 2 insider disciples from being seen as egotistical, pushy power grabbers. It's their mother who's asking and softening their names. But again, in Mark, they're named. It's them. The language is slightly more humble. Very interesting distinction. Nevertheless, the disciples are very suspicious because they know power grabs, ego, bad. Not a good thing. So, what to make of this story? I feel like there's a part A of the story, James and John, that dynamic, and a part B of the story, the disciples, saying, what's going on here? Jesus responds to the 10 by saying, guys, remember I've told you before, it is a servant's life that we are a part of. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. I want to make sure you know that there are 2 ways in this world. There's our way, the way of service, and then there's the other way, the way of tyrants. Tyrants. Very interesting. Even this morning, as I was thinking about that word tyrant, I didn't have time to do this, so I'll do a little research maybe this week. In Jesus' use of the word tyrants, he's naming his political context. If I was reading this, years ago, if I had heard the word tyrants, I'd be like, oh yeah, the ancient world, there were tyrants in the ancient world. And then when I had studied the Bible a little bit more, I'd know, oh, tyrants. That's code word for Rome, an empire. And, since then I've done more study about the Roman Empire and the idea of empire and oppression and where Jesus and his followers would have been in that realm of things. And I wondered, is this the first time that Jesus gets a little political? That he is naming the political system? Because prior to this, he's naming the religious system. You might remember this from last week. Jesus was warning them about the religious elite and that they were dysfunctional. And the religious elite was kind of getting connected to Herod. It sounded like there were some stirrings there. But here, Jesus talks about the government, the system that he is a part of. And he says, the great ones in this political system that we're a part of are called tyrants. Tyrants. And he said, not our way. Jesus draws this huge distinction. Servants, tyrants. What's the difference? Well, the word tyrants got me thinking about today. And this week, I happened to watch a documentary on Navalny. Have you guys heard of Alexei Navalny before? So, Alexei Navalny is the big opposition leader to perhaps the world's greatest tyrant, Putin. Putin hates Navalny so much that Putin will not even say Navalny's name. To which I say, Navalny, Navalny, Navalny. This documentary was so interesting. You know, when you hear some details, you'll be like, oh, wait a minute, I have heard of Navalny before. And this documentary actually got the Academy Award a week ago for documentaries this year. So Navalny, he's a Russian opposition leader. So in the documentary, you got to see, some of his background and, how he organized people to speak up against Putin and the problems with Putin, in case they're not obvious to us. Once again, Putin was in the news the last 48 hours. Did you hear that? The ICC, the International Criminal Court, has deemed him guilty of war crimes, among which, is already obvious. He bombs civilians and children and medical establishments and is brutal and is in an unjust situation, yada, yada, yada. And in addition to that, he's been kidnapping Ukrainian children and bringing them back to Russia. So thoroughly, I think we could agree, tyrant status. So how does Navalny stand up to this tyrant? So I'm just fascinated. Like, how do you do that? Well, in one part of the documentary, Navalny says, I don't have money. So it just cracks me up. Like, Navalny does not have money to make this fight against Putin. And Putin, one of his crimes before the current crime, is that he is enriching himself in the coffers of his country. So he's a criminal. He is taking money. And so Navalny was, just saying the facts, here's the receipts on what's going on. So, we talked about this last week. Somebody who abuses power, are they going to say, oh, thank you for pointing out my abuse of power? That doesn't happen in people like this. Instead, Putin put a target on Navalny's back. So this is where maybe you might remember this. Navalny was poisoned. And of course, the Russian leadership said, oh, that wasn't us, couldn't have been us. So Navalny was poisoned. It was a mystery, like, why is he taken sick? What's going on? It took a lot of investigation to kind of sort out. But the Russian medical people that were tied in with Putin tried to scrub any sort of tie back to the fact that he was poisoned. So he should have died. It was Novichok, that he was a nerve agent that just kills you and then it drains out of your system and there's no clue left of what killed you. But somehow Navalny got to medical assistance soon enough that they were able to reverse the course of this poisoning. And then he was medically evacuated to Germany, where he had a full recovery. And then more investigative work came out. They knew exactly. That's the longer story. Watch the documentary of how the poisoning occurred. Funny little thing. Well, okay, spoiler alert. They poisoned him through probably a laundry service, his underwear. So crazy. They completely figured it out, and they even got one of the insiders to corroborate the story. So it's just absolutely crazy. And then, of course, the government said, we didn't do that, and then, they had video and record of it. Interesting story. So, so what did Navalny do? He was safe in Germany. Once he was fully recovered, and it was a long recovery, he flew back to Moscow with his wife. By the way, his wife's name is, do you know his wife's name? Yulia is her name. So when he and his wife flew back to Moscow, he knew pretty much what was going to happen. He was arrested in the airport. He's still in prison today. Wow, how do you deal with tyranny? How? So depressing, you know? By chance, I also am listening to a book on tape. It's a memoir of Maria Presa, who is in the Philippines. She's a journalist in the Philippines. And the title of her book is How to Stand Up to a Dictator. She also was standing up in her country, speaking the truth. Speaking the truth, having moral high ground, and that got a target on her back from President Duterte. And I'm at the point of the book where she's arrested for telling the truth. What makes people able to speak up to tyrants? And then I wonder, tyrants look at these people like, oh, look at them, look at their big egos, and tyrants say, I'm the victim here. How do we, as people of faith, sort out all the finger pointing? Who's acting on ego? Who's acting in the service of morality and truth? It's a tricky thing. And Jesus says, again, there's tyrants and there's servants. And if you're following me, it's the way of servants. The way of servants. A lot could be said about the way of being a servant. Last week we talked a little bit about ego. It's not about you. It's not self-serving. I was heartened to see, I did a little extra reading on Navalny, that he was an atheist who has become Orthodox Christian. And he said that Christianity helped connect him to something larger than himself. Another interesting thing, Maria Presa, she said given all the brutality that she has seen around the world, actually, she could have lost faith. And for her, she has kept faith, her faith in God. She's grown up Catholic. And it could have made her very cynical about some of the brutality. And Duterte's brutality includes, it's called extrajudicial killings. So his way to solve drug problem is to kill people. So that's called, really should go through the court system and not have hired killers kill people. So problematic. Well, how do we know that someone like Navalny, someone like Maria Presa, are not just acting on ego? How do we know that they're not on the side, or sometimes, if you did the Hunger Games, sometimes tyranny begets tyranny in a lot of ways. The people who seek to correct a tyrant become tyrannical themselves. Is it an endless cycle? Should we just be cynical of everybody? Should we despair? Because it's so overwhelming. How do you not despair? Well, this was asked of Navalny and Maria Presa. What kept them going? And Maria Presa said, the facts. I have data on my side. And it made me think of Exodus 20, verse 16. That's part of the 10 Commandments that says, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So, how do you sort out what the truth is? Not bearing false witness, there's that kind of truth, data truth, and then there's moral truth, the truth of how we treat one another and looking out for everybody else. So where to take all this today? I'll go back to James and John. Were they being egotistical? Jesus, we'd really like good seating. Can you arrange some good seating for us? Was it a power grab? I like to think that they knew a little bit about what they were asking. They knew about humility, and they also knew about courage. And we need to keep our courage up, because tyranny is everywhere. It's not just governments. Tyranny is in our own brains. tyranny happens in families and groups and systems. It's just anywhere where something gets tilted toward one person's ego or emotional vortex, rather than the way of service and looking out for everyone. How do we keep our spirits up and not be accused falsely, oh, it's about your ego now? I think the way is being rooted in humility. Being rooted in humility. Now, I don't have a lot of money. Being rooted in humility. Here's the facts. I'm not making this up. Being rooted in humility. How are others being treated in all of this? Courage or faith. Faith is just an amazing, amazing thing that helps us not despair. So here we are, Cup of Life Cafe. And this James and John story was actually the anchor for this whole series of Lent, that where we got the cup of life. I was looking at this story. So what are we to take from James and John, this whole complex, nuanced story? I think it's the fact that you can be humble and you can be courageous and you can be misinterpreted and told you're being political. And yet you can rise. You can rise with humility, with courage and faith, and continue to draw power from the Holy Spirit to try to say what's right and wrong, no matter what's going on. And if somebody accuses you otherwise, you can think, I'm just a server in the Cup of Life Cafe. And I wondered today if we should rename the cafe to Sons of Thunder. The Sons of Thunder Cafe. So you are all part of that cafe, and may you find that flavor of service in your daily life. To God be the glory. Amen. Put your apron on.